In the heart of Arlington Heights, power belonged to the wealthy, the connected, and the corrupt. At the center of it all stood Ethan Kingsley, the heir to Kingsley Holdings, a sprawling real estate empire that had turned generations of working-class neighborhoods into luxury apartments and high-end retail spaces. His influence stretched through the city council, the police department, and even the court system. He had built his empire not through hard work, but through intimidation, bribery, and strategic exploitation of the city's most vulnerable communities. The only thing standing between Ethan and the completion of his latest development project was a single house on the corner of Rosewood and Fifth, a modest but well-kept craftsman home owned by Evelyn Carter, the last original home in the neighborhood. At 72, Evelyn Carter had lived in that house her entire life. It was where her parents had raised her, where she and her late husband had built a family, and where countless neighborhood gatherings had taken place over the decades. It wasn't just a house. It was the last remnant of a dying community. Evelyn had turned down multiple offers from Kingsley Holdings, even when they had offered double the market value. She had refused to sign over her legacy for the sake of profit. Ethan Kingsley wasn't used to hearing no. It started with threats. Anonymous letters slid under her door, phone calls in the middle of the night, strange cars idling in front of her house at all hours. Then came the property code violations. Faulty wiring, unsafe structures, noise complaint from neighbors Evelyn had known her whole life. The city inspectors, undoubtedly influenced by Kingsley's reach, seemed determined to make her life miserable. But Evelyn had weathered storms before. She had grown up during segregation, marched for civil rights, and fought for her place in a world that often didn't want her there. She wasn't going to let some entitled real estate mogul bully her out of her home. But then everything changed. It was the night of the Harrison Heights Art Gala, a charity event hosted by Kingsley Holdings to revitalize the city. Evelyn had attended at the invitation of her neighbor's daughter, Maya Richardson, a rising artist whose work was being showcased at the event. Evelyn had arrived dressed in her Sunday best, a modest navy blue dress, pearl earrings, and her late husband's gold watch on her wrist. The gallery was filled with Arlington Heights elite, city council members, business owners, and socialites sipping champagne and speaking in hushed, sophisticated tones. Evelyn felt out of place, but smiled when Maya approached her with a bright grin. "I'm so glad you came, Miss Carter," Maya said, her excitement genuine. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, sweetheart," Evelyn replied warmly. As Evelyn admired one of Maya's paintings, a vibrant portrait of their neighborhood, she noticed Ethan Kingsley standing across the room, holding an untouched glass of champagne. He was watching her. His cold, calculating gaze sent a chill down her spine. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host announced over the microphone, "if I could have your attention." The crowd quieted. The host smiled nervously. "It appears we have an unfortunate incident. The Cunningham sapphire, valued at over $2 million, has gone missing from the display case. Security is reviewing the footage now." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Guests exchanged wide-eyed glances. Moments later, 3 uniformed officers entered the gallery. Evelyn's heart clenched when one of them, a broad-shouldered man with a permanent scowl, walked straight toward her. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you," Officer Crowe said, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Evelyn frowned. "About what?" Officer Payne, a younger officer with narrow eyes, stepped forward. "We've received a report that you were seen lingering near the display case before the sapphire went missing." Evelyn's heart thudded painfully in her chest. "That's not true. I only just arrived." Crowe's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step outside." Maya stepped forward. "This is ridiculous. She didn't do anything." Crowe's hand moved toward his taser. "Step back, miss." "I've done nothing wrong," Evelyn said calmly, "and I will not allow you to search my belongings without cause." Officer Payne's hand shot out and ripped Evelyn's purse from her arm. He opened it and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Slowly, he unwrapped it and held up a sapphire necklace that gleamed under the gallery lights. The gasps turned to whispers. "I don't know how that got there," Evelyn said, her voice steady but her hands trembling. Crowe's gaze darkened. "Evelyn Carter, you're under arrest for grand larceny." The words rang out like a gunshot through the gallery. "Wait," Maya shouted. "You can't." Crow spun her around roughly and forced her hands behind her back. The click of the handcuffs echoed through the room. As Evelyn was led through the gallery, the whispers followed her. "I always thought she was so kind. How sad. Guess you never really know people." Outside, news cameras were already rolling. A reporter shoved a microphone toward her face as the officers loaded her into the back of a police car. "You're making a mistake," Evelyn said as they shoved her into the back seat. Crow smirked. "We'll see about that." The doors slammed shut. Evelyn sat stiffly as the car pulled away from the curb. Through the tinted glass, she saw Ethan Kingsley standing on the sidewalk, watching her leave with a small, satisfied smile. He had won, or so he thought, because the moment the handcuffs snapped shut around her wrists, Evelyn Carter knew one thing for certain. Her son was coming. 2,000 miles away, in a secure military base in North Carolina, Major Daniel Carter sat in a dimly lit briefing room reviewing satellite footage of an overseas target. His phone buzzed. Only 2 people in the world had access to that line. He answered. "Mom." Evelyn's voice was calm. "I need you." Daniel's gaze sharpened instantly. His mind, conditioned by years of combat and intelligence work, shifted into mission mode. "Where are you?" "Arlington Heights Police Department. Theft and obstruction." "That's not possible," Daniel said, already standing and heading toward the exit. "Who set you up?" "I have a strong suspicion." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I'm on my way." As Daniel boarded a military transport jet with 2 members of his elite tactical team, he sent a secure message to his second-in-command. Mission priority: uncover the truth, expose the corruption, destroy the enemy. In the back of the police car, Evelyn smiled faintly. They had made one mistake. They underestimated her. Evelyn sat stiffly on the hard metal bench of the holding cell, her hands resting on her lap. The cold steel of the handcuffs had left faint red marks on her wrists, but she didn't flinch. Her eyes remained calm, focused, not on the cinderblock walls of the cell or the sound of the other inmates murmuring nearby, but on the bigger picture. They wanted her humiliated. That's why they had staged the arrest so publicly, why the news cameras had been tipped off in advance. Someone had planned this carefully, and she had a very good idea who that someone was. 2 officers stood outside the holding cell, Officer Crow and Officer Payne. Crow leaned casually against the wall, arms crossed, smirking as he watched her. Payne, shorter and younger, hovered beside him, glancing nervously toward the hallway. Crow chuckled. "Not so proud now, are you?" Evelyn's gaze didn't shift. "I hope you understand the consequences of what you've just done." "Oh, we understand," Crow said, the grin widening on his face. "You're the last holdout in the district. And now, with this little incident, the city will have no choice but to condemn your property. Kingsley Holdings will finally get their development plans approved." Evelyn's jaw tightened. So that was the plan. Force her to sell by destroying her reputation. Once her name was tarnished, the community would abandon her, and Kingsley would swoop in and buy the property for half its value. It was brilliant in a sinister kind of way. Crow's eyes narrowed. "You really thought you could stand against Ethan Kingsley?" He leaned closer to the bars. "Lady, you don't stand a chance." Evelyn's expression remained calm. "We'll see about that." The heavy metal door at the end of the hallway swung open, and a uniformed officer entered. Detective Lawrence, a tall, graying man with tired eyes, walked toward the cell, a file tucked under his arm. Crow straightened, his smirk fading slightly. "Open it," Lawrence said, gesturing toward the cell. Crow hesitated. "Sir, we have standing orders from." "I don't give a damn about your standing orders," Lawrence snapped. "Open the damn cell." Crow's jaw tightened, but he produced the key and unlocked the cell. Evelyn stood, brushing imaginary dust from her dress before stepping calmly into the hallway. "You're coming with me," Lawrence said. Crow's hand dropped toward his baton. "What are you doing?" Lawrence shot him a sharp look. "Following the law. You should try it sometime." Evelyn's heels echoed against the polished floor as Lawrence led her toward a side door. A long hallway stretched ahead of them, empty except for one man standing at the far end. Evelyn's heart lifted slightly at the sight of her son. Daniel Carter stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his military posture unmistakable. His sharp eyes took in every detail, every exit, every camera, the number of officers stationed nearby. He wore a fitted black suit, but the sharpness of his gaze gave away his military background. Daniel's gaze softened only slightly when his eyes met his mother's. "Mom." "Daniel." Lawrence gestured toward the door. "She's being transferred for further questioning." Daniel's voice was steady and controlled. "No, she's not." Crow stepped forward. "Excuse me." Daniel produced a piece of paper from his inside pocket. "This is a federal writ of habeas corpus, signed by Judge Hawkins, United States District Court. My mother is now in federal custody." Lawrence raised an eyebrow. "How the hell did you manage that?" Daniel smiled faintly. "I have connections." Crow's face darkened. "You think you can just waltz in here and take her out of my custody?" Daniel's gaze sharpened. "I don't think. I know." Evelyn stepped toward her son. Daniel extended his arm, guiding her carefully toward the door. "You just made a big mistake," Crow growled. Daniel's eyes flashed dangerously. "No, you did." Outside the police station, reporters swarmed the sidewalk, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward as Daniel escorted Evelyn toward a black SUV. "Miss Carter, did you really steal the Cunningham sapphire? Is this a cover-up by the Carter family? Did you resist arrest?" Daniel's hand remained firmly on his mother's arm as he guided her into the back seat. He shut the door, climbed into the driver's seat, and peeled away from the curb without answering a single question. They drove in silence for several blocks before Evelyn finally spoke. "They want the house," she said quietly. Daniel's jaw clenched. "I figured. They planted the necklace in my purse," Evelyn continued. "They knew I would never consent to a search, so they used the theft accusation to justify it." Daniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Kingsley?" Evelyn nodded. "Kingsley." Daniel's eyes darkened. "We're going to end this." "Ow!" Daniel's gaze sharpened. "First, we uncover the truth. Then we expose it." Media backlash. The footage of Evelyn's arrest spread like wildfire across social media and the evening news. The images were damning. An elderly black woman, handcuffed and shoved into the back of a police car, while well-dressed socialites whispered in the background. Online comments ranged from shock to outrage. "This is disgusting. They arrested a 72-year-old woman for a necklace." Kingsley strikes again. But it wasn't just the public that took notice. A few days after the arrest, Ethan Kingsley stood before a room of investors, trying to salvage his latest project. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, he smiled thinly as reporters snapped pictures. "Our plan for the revitalization of Arlington Heights remain on schedule," Kingsley announced smoothly. A reporter raised his hand. "Mr. Kingsley, any comment on the allegations that your company may have been involved in the arrest of Evelyn Carter?" Kingsley's smile didn't falter. "That's nonsense. Kingsley Holdings had nothing to do with Miss Carter's legal troubles." "Really?" A voice called from the back of the room. Kingsley's eyes narrowed as Daniel Carter stepped through the crowd. His crisp black suit and the steady confidence in his step made several reporters turn toward him. Daniel smiled faintly. "Because I have evidence that says otherwise." Kingsley's smile tightened. "I'm sorry, who are you?" "Major Daniel Carter," Daniel said. "U.S. Army Special Forces, retired." The room fell quiet. Daniel pulled a flash drive from his pocket and held it up. "And this contains records of wire transfers from Kingsley Holdings to Arlington PD, dated 2 days before my mother's arrest. Funny how that works out." Kingsley's eyes darkened. "You have no right." Daniel's smile turned sharp. "I have every right." Back at home, Evelyn sat in her living room, a cup of tea in her hand as she watched the news coverage. Daniel entered, standing at the doorway. "It's starting to unravel," he said. Evelyn smiled faintly. "Good. They won't go down easily," Daniel warned. "I know," Evelyn replied. "But they've already made their mistake." Daniel sat down across from her. "What mistake is that?" Evelyn's gaze sharpened. "They underestimated us." The sky over Arlington Heights was dark and heavy with the promise of rain. The streetlights flickered as Daniel Carter stood at the edge of his mother's front porch, hands tucked into the pockets of his dark jacket. His sharp eyes scanned the street, noting the unmarked black sedan parked across the road. The windows were tinted, but Daniel could feel the gaze of the men inside. Surveillance. Kingsley's men were watching them. Inside the house, Evelyn Carter sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea resting between her hands. Her expression was calm, but Daniel knew his mother well enough to sense the storm beneath her stillness. "Mom." Evelyn's gaze lifted. Daniel took a seat across from her. His jaw was tight. "They're watching us." "Of course they are," Evelyn replied evenly. "That's what men like Kingsley do. They intimidate, they spy, and when they think you're weak, they strike." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "They picked the wrong family." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Yes, they did." Daniel's phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up and saw a message from Marcus Taylor. "Got something? You'll want to see this." Daniel stood. "I need to meet Marcus." Evelyn's gaze sharpened. "Be careful." Daniel bent down and kissed her forehead. "I always am." The evidence. Daniel arrived at Marcus's apartment, a small but well-secured space in the heart of the city. Marcus Taylor sat in front of an array of monitors, his fingers flying over the keyboard as lines of code scrolled across the screens. Marcus, a wiry man in his mid-30s with quick eyes and an easy grin, glanced up as Daniel entered. "Tell me you've got something." "Oh, I've got more than something," Marcus replied, spinning his chair toward one of the larger monitors. "Remember those wire transfers I pulled from Kingsley's accounts?" Daniel nodded. Marcus clicked a few keys, and the screen filled with banking details and timestamps. "The transfer to Preston, the one right before your mom's arrest? That wasn't the only one." Marcus pointed to the screen. "Here's another one, and another, all within the last 3 months." Daniel leaned forward. "What are they paying for?" Marcus's smile widened. "Bribes. Kingsley Holdings has been funneling money into Arlington PD and the City Council. Campaign donations, sure, but also off-the-record payments. And get this." He clicked to a separate folder. A series of scanned documents filled the screen. "Kingsley Holdings has been fast-tracking permits and rezoning applications for months," Marcus said. "Guess whose signature is on all of them?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Judge Whitmore." Marcus nodded. "Kingsley's been greasing the wheels at every level. He's not just trying to force your mom out. He's been rigging the system for years." Daniel's gaze sharpened. "How airtight is this?" Marcus leaned back. "Rock solid. But there's more." He pulled up another file. "This is from Preston's gallery security system." The screen displayed grainy black and white footage from the night of the art gala. Marcus enhanced the image, and suddenly, the figure of Victor Preston was clearly visible, standing near the display case where the Cunningham sapphire had been stolen. "What is he doing?" Daniel asked. Marcus zoomed in on Preston's hands. He was holding a small velvet pouch. "Planting evidence," Marcus said. Daniel's eyes darkened. "He planted the necklace in my mother's purse." Marcus smiled. "And now we have proof." Daniel straightened. "Send me everything." Marcus tapped a key, and Daniel's phone buzzed with a new file transfer. "This is enough to sink Kingsley," Marcus said. Daniel shook his head. "Not yet." Marcus frowned. "What are you waiting for?" Daniel's expression hardened. "We don't just want to sink him. We want to expose him publicly." Marcus grinned. "Now you're speaking my language." The strategy. Back at the house, Daniel spread the files across the kitchen table. Evelyn studied them carefully. "So this is how they've been doing it," Evelyn murmured. Daniel nodded. "We have enough to bring down Kingsley, Preston, and Judge Whitmore." Evelyn's eyes darkened. "But they'll bury it unless we make it impossible to cover up." "That's the plan," Daniel replied. He placed his phone on the table and called David Wilson. David picked up on the second ring. "Carter, we're ready to go," Daniel said. David's tone sharpened. "What's the play?" "We make it public," Daniel replied. "All of it. Financial records, the security footage, everything." David's voice was cold. "And the fallout?" "We make sure the right people are watching," Daniel said. 2 hours later, Evelyn and Daniel sat side by side in the living room. The news was already circulating on social media. Daniel's phone buzzed. It was Marcus. "You're not going to believe this," Marcus said, his voice tight with excitement. "Kingsley's holding a press conference. It starts in 10 minutes. Daniel smiled faintly. "Perfect. The public confrontation." Ethan Kingsley stood at the podium, wearing a tailored suit and his trademark smug expression. Flashbulbs exploded as he adjusted the microphone. "We at Kingsley Holdings remain committed to the revitalization of Arlington Heights," Kingsley said. "The recent accusations against me and my company are baseless and politically motivated." From the back of the crowd, Daniel's voice carried over the noise. "Are you sure about that, Kingsley?" Kingsley's eyes narrowed. He spotted Daniel and Evelyn standing near the press corps. Daniel stepped forward. "Because I have proof." The reporters turned toward him. Daniel held up his phone, and Marcus, who was monitoring the live stream, uploaded the footage directly to the press's live feed. The crowd fell silent as the screen behind Kingsley lit up. The footage played. It showed Preston planting the necklace. Then it cut to the financial records, documents with Kingsley's signature authorizing payments to Preston and Judge Whitmore. Kingsley's face paled. "Do you deny these payments?" Daniel asked coldly. Kingsley's mouth opened, but no sound came out. "What about the property deals?" Daniel pressed. "Bribing a judge, framing an elderly woman. What part of this is revitalization?" Kingsley's face twisted. This is out of context." "Out of context?" Daniel's voice sharpened. "Or just the truth?" The reporters erupted with questions. Kingsley backed away from the podium. A moment later, a group of uniformed officers pushed through the crowd. Detective Lawrence stepped forward, holding a warrant. "Ethan Kingsley," Lawrence said, "you're under arrest for bribery, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. You can't do this." Kingsley protested as Lawrence slapped handcuffs onto his wrists. Lawrence smiled faintly. "Actually, we can." Kingsley's gaze shot toward Daniel and Evelyn as the officers led him away. Daniel's expression remained cold. Evelyn's gaze, however, was calm, almost pitying. Kingsley had thought he was untouchable. He wasn't. The aftermath. That night, Evelyn and Daniel sat on the front porch of her house. "You did it," Evelyn said quietly. Daniel shook his head. "We did it." Evelyn smiled. "I'm proud of you." Daniel's gaze sharpened. "It's not over. Whitmore and Preston will try to cut deals." Evelyn's smile faded. "Then we'll remind them what happens when you underestimate the Carters." Daniel's eyes darkened. "Next step?" Evelyn's gaze hardened. "We finish it." The sun was setting over Arlington Heights, casting long shadows over the city skyline. The streets were still buzzing with the fallout from Ethan Kingsley's arrest. The footage of his public humiliation had spread like wildfire, dominating the news cycle and social media for the past 24 hours. Even national networks had picked it up. Real estate mogul arrested for fraud and bribery. Kingsley empire collapsing. Elderly woman falsely accused in high-stakes scandal. Kingsley's empire was crumbling. But Daniel Carter knew better than to celebrate just yet. Taking down Kingsley had only been the first step. Now, they had to make sure the damage was permanent. Daniel sat at the head of the dining room table, his laptop open and files spread out in front of him. Across from him sat David Wilson, his dark suit slightly rumpled after a long day in court. Marcus Taylor lounged nearby, scrolling through his phone, his expression unusually tense. Evelyn Carter stood at the stove, stirring a pot of tea. Her posture was relaxed, but her eyes were sharp as she listened to the conversation unfolding around her. David set down a folder. "Kingsley's lawyers are already trying to negotiate a deal." "Let them," Daniel said. His voice was cold. "We're not here for a plea bargain." "They're panicking," Marcus added. The stock for Kingsley Holdings dropped 14% in the last 2 hours. Their board of directors is already talking about replacing him. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "They think cutting Kingsley loose will save them." David nodded. "Exactly. They'll try to isolate the damage. Make Kingsley the scapegoat while they salvage the business." "Then we hit them harder," Daniel said. David's brow furrowed. "With what?" Daniel leaned back, his expression calculating. "We have enough evidence to implicate not just Kingsley, but Judge Whitmore and half the city council. We take down the entire network." David hesitated. "If you push too hard, they'll push back." "Let them," Daniel replied. Marcus glanced up from his phone. "There's more." Daniel's gaze sharpened. "What?" Marcus tossed his phone onto the table. Kingsley Holdings transferred $3 million to an offshore account last night. David's eyes narrowed. Who owns the account? Marcus's smile was sharp. Judge Whitmore. David swore under his breath. Kingsley is paying Whitmore to protect him. Or to cover his tracks, Daniel said. Which means Whitmore is still dangerous. And still in power, David added. Evelyn set a tray of tea on the table. Her hands were steady as she poured a cup and handed it to Daniel. Then it's time to finish this, Evelyn said calmly. Daniel smiled faintly. That's exactly what I was thinking. The courtroom. The next morning, Daniel and Evelyn arrived at the Arlington Heights courthouse. Reporters swarmed the steps, microphones and cameras flashing as they walked toward the entrance. Miss Carter, any comment on Ethan Kingsley's arrest? Mr. Carter, is your mother planning to press charges for false imprisonment? Do you think Judge Whitmore was involved? Daniel ignored the questions, guiding Evelyn up the marble steps with a steady hand on her arm. Inside the courthouse, Judge Howard Whitmore sat behind his high wooden bench, his expression calm but his eyes cold. He wore a tailored black robe, his silver hair neatly combed back. Ethan Kingsley sat at the defendant's table, flanked by 3 high-powered attorneys. He looked pale, his once confident demeanor replaced by quiet tension. Daniel and Evelyn sat behind David, who stood as the court clerk called the session to order. Judge Whitmore's gaze swept over the courtroom. This hearing is to determine the validity of the charges against Mr. Kingsley and to review any additional evidence presented by the prosecution. David rose smoothly. Your Honor, the defense has submitted a motion to dismiss. We have substantial new evidence that directly implicates not only Mr. Kingsley, but several other parties. Whitmore's jaw tightened. Proceed. David pulled out a flash drive and handed it to the court clerk. Moments later, the video screen in the courtroom flickered to life. The first image was the wire transfer records Marcus had uncovered. Ethan Kingsley's name and Judge Whitmore's signature were clearly visible. A low murmur swept through the room. The next image showed security footage of Kingsley's men handing off a briefcase to a city council member. Then another image, Kingsley shaking hands with Whitmore behind closed doors. And finally, the footage of Victor Preston planting the Cunningham sapphire in Evelyn's purse. The courtroom was deathly silent. David's voice was cool and steady. Your Honor, these records establish a clear pattern of bribery, fraud, and conspiracy between Kingsley Holdings and city officials, including this court. Whitmore's face paled. David turned toward him. Do you have anything to say, Your Honor? Whitmore's mouth tightened. I will not engage in speculation. David cut him off. Speculation? This evidence speaks for itself. Judge Whitmore's gaze sharpened. I am warning you. Are you? Daniel's voice cut through the courtroom like steel. He rose slowly, his gaze locked on Whitmore. Because it seems to me you're out of warnings. Whitmore's hand tightened on his gavel. You're out of order. No, Daniel said coldly. You're out of time. The courtroom doors opened, and 2 uniformed federal agents stepped inside. One of them approached the bench and handed Whitmore a sealed envelope. The agent's voice was crisp. Judge Whitmore, you are hereby relieved of duty, pending an investigation into allegations of bribery and conspiracy. The courtroom exploded into noise. Whitmore's face twisted. You can't do this. The agent's hand settled on Whitmore's shoulder. Actually, we can. As Whitmore was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Daniel stepped toward Kingsley. You thought you were untouchable, Daniel said softly. Kingsley's gaze was cold. You've made a powerful enemy. Daniel's smile was faint and dangerous. No, I just took one down. Back at home. Later that evening, Evelyn stood on the front porch, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. Daniel stood beside her, his hands resting on the wooden railing. They're not done yet, Evelyn said quietly. Daniel's gaze sharpened. No, but neither are we. Evelyn smiled faintly. Kingsley's empire is broken. Whitmore's power is gone, but they'll try to regroup. Daniel nodded. And when they do, we'll be ready. The streetlights flickered as a sleek black sedan pulled to the curb. Marcus climbed out, his phone in hand. You're going to want to see this, Marcus said. Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced down at the screen. New lead. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands linked to multiple Arlington Heights Council members. Daniel's smile was slow and sharp. They're running scared, Marcus said. And now we know where to strike next, Daniel replied. Evelyn's gaze remained steady. Finish it. Daniel's eyes hardened. With pleasure. The early morning sun cast a muted glow over Arlington Heights as Daniel Carter stood on the balcony of his penthouse apartment, overlooking the city below. From this height, the skyline was deceptively peaceful, the sharp angles of steel and glass reflecting soft hues of gold and pink. But Daniel wasn't fooled by appearances. Beneath that polished surface, the city was in turmoil. Ethan Kingsley was in custody, awaiting trial on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and bribery. Judge Whitmore had been stripped of his position and was facing his own set of federal charges. Kingsley Holdings was in freefall, their board of directors scrambling to salvage what was left of their crumbling empire. But the rot went deeper than Kingsley and Whitmore. Kingsley had been the face of the corruption, but the system, the network of dirty council members, compromised officials, and law enforcement officers who had enabled him, was still intact. Cutting off the head wasn't enough. The body had to die too, and Daniel was ready to make that happen. Marcus Taylor sat at the kitchen counter, his laptop open in front of him. He was sipping coffee from a chipped mug, eyes fixed on the glowing screen. "Let me guess," Daniel said as he stepped into the room. "You found something." Marcus smiled faintly. "I always find something." He turned the laptop toward Daniel. The screen displayed a series of offshore accounts, each one linked to Kingsley Holdings and various city officials. "The money trails deeper than we thought," Marcus said. "Not just Kingsley and Whitmore. There are over 10 council members tied to these accounts. Campaign donations, consulting fees, land deals, it's all here." Daniel's eyes darkened. "How long has this been going on?" "Years," Marcus replied. "Kingsley didn't build this empire overnight. He bought the city piece by piece. And Whitmore made sure no one could touch him." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Until now." Marcus's grin widened. "Exactly." Daniel pulled out his phone and called David Wilson. David picked up on the second ring. "Carter, we have enough," Daniel said. "It's time to bring the whole thing down." David's voice sharpened. "How far are we taking this?" "All the way," Daniel replied. "The strategy." 2 hours later, Daniel, Marcus, and David sat around Evelyn's dining room table. The files were spread out between them: bank records, real estate contracts, internal emails, and security footage. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, her gaze steady. "What's the plan?" "We hit them where it hurts," Daniel said. "Marcus, you'll leak the financial records to the press." Marcus's smile sharpened. "With pleasure." David leaned forward. "What about the council?" "We name them all," Daniel replied. "No deals, no cover-ups. We push for full-scale indictments." David's brow furrowed. "If we do that, the city could collapse." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "Then let it collapse. We rebuild it afterward, cleaner." Evelyn's lips curled slightly. "And Kingsley?" Daniel's gaze darkened. "We make sure he doesn't walk away from this." David nodded. "This will make enemies." Daniel's smile was cold. "Good." The exposure. That night, Marcus uploaded the files to a secure server. He sent encrypted links to every major news outlet in the country. The story broke within hours. Exposed. Kingsley Holdings' bribery and fraud scandal goes deeper than expected. Arlington Heights City Council under investigation. Judge Whitmore facing additional charges of obstruction of justice. The footage of Preston planting the necklace in Evelyn's purse was replayed on a loop. News anchors dissected the financial records, detailing the extent of Kingsley's influence over the city. But the real damage came from the emails. Marcus had pulled them from Kingsley's encrypted servers, exchanges between Kingsley and half the city council, detailing how they manipulated zoning laws, evicted families from their homes, and falsified building permits to benefit Kingsley Holdings. The scandal became national news. The Department of Justice announced a formal investigation into the Arlington Heights City Council. The FBI issued subpoenas to half the city's leadership. Council members resigned. Some were already preparing legal defenses. Others were considering plea deals. And Kingsley Holdings? Their board voted to dissolve the company by the end of the month. The fallout. Daniel stood in the lobby of the Arlington Heights courthouse, his hands in his pockets. The polished marble floors gleamed beneath the harsh overhead lights. Across the lobby, Ethan Kingsley stood between two of his lawyers. He wore an expensive suit, but the weight of the situation was clear in the tension around his jaw. His face was drawn and pale. Kingsley's lawyers were negotiating terms with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Kingsley was offering to provide evidence against the city council in exchange for leniency. Daniel approached slowly, his steps deliberate. Kingsley's eyes lifted toward him. His expression darkened. "You did this," Kingsley said coldly. Daniel's smile was thin. "Yes, I did." Kingsley's jaw tightened. "This city needs me. Without Kingsley Holdings, Arlington Heights will fall apart." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "No, Ethan, this city will survive. You're the one who's finished." Kingsley's eyes flashed. "You think this is over?" Daniel's gaze sharpened. "I know it's over." Kingsley's lips curled into a sneer. "You've made powerful enemies." Daniel's smile sharpened. "So have you." The elevator doors opened. Kingsley's lawyers pulled him toward it. As the doors slid shut, Kingsley's eyes remained locked on Daniel's. Daniel stood motionless until the elevator was gone. Then he turned and walked away. The closure. That evening, Evelyn and Daniel sat on the porch of her house. The neighborhood was quiet for the first time in years. The house had been declared a historic landmark by the city, protected from demolition under new preservation laws. Evelyn took a sip of tea. "You didn't just protect our home, Daniel. You protected this entire neighborhood." Daniel smiled faintly. "It's not over yet. There's still rebuilding to do." Evelyn's gaze softened. "But now we're rebuilding on our terms." Marcus stepped onto the porch, holding his phone. "Guess who's singing?" Marcus said with a grin. "Kingsley's flipping. He's cutting a deal to implicate Whitmore, Preston, and half the council." Daniel's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Coward." Marcus chuckled. "They're all falling apart." Daniel nodded. "Good." Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced down at the screen, then frowned. Daniel's eyes sharpened. "What?" Marcus hesitated. "There's another account." Daniel's expression darkened. "From who?" Marcus held up the phone. "It's linked to Senator Malcolm Price. And the transfer date's back 5 years. Evelyn's gaze sharpened. Kingsley was never the real top of the chain. Daniel's jaw tightened. "It's deeper than we thought." Marcus smiled. "So what's next?" Daniel stood, his expression calm but lethal. "We finish what we started." Evelyn smiled faintly. "And this time we take down the whole system." Daniel's gaze was cold. Every last piece of it. The late afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of Evelyn Carter's living room, casting soft patterns on the polished hardwood floor. Outside, Arlington Heights was quieter than it had been in years. The usual noise of construction crews and traffic had faded, leaving behind a calm that felt almost unnatural. Evelyn sat on the couch, a cup of tea resting between her hands. Her posture was relaxed, but her eyes were sharp as they tracked Daniel, who stood across the room, pacing like a predator. His phone was pressed to his ear, his expression dark. "Yes, Marcus," Daniel said evenly. "I want the financial records from the Price account cross-checked with Kingsley's files, and I want it done before morning." Marcus's voice crackled faintly through the speaker. "Already working on it. But this is big, Daniel. If Price is involved." "He's involved," Daniel interrupted. "Kingsley was never the endgame." Marcus sighed. "And if we take down a sitting senator?" Daniel's expression was cold. "Then we make sure the evidence is airtight before we go public." He ended the call and slid the phone into his pocket. Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. "It's bigger than Kingsley, isn't it?" Daniel nodded. "It's systemic. You said Kingsley's empire was collapsing." "It is," Daniel replied. "But now we know why it existed in the first place." Evelyn's brow furrowed. "Price." Daniel nodded. "Senator Malcolm Price. Kingsley was just a piece of the puzzle. Price was the architect." Evelyn's lips tightened. "And now?" Daniel's gaze sharpened. "Now we burn it all down." The senator. Senator Malcolm Price had represented Arlington Heights for over 20 years. He was the golden boy of the political elite, a man whose campaign slogans about progress and economic revitalization had earned him wide support from both business leaders and working-class voters alike. What the public didn't know was that Price had been working with Kingsley for years. Kingsley was the front man, the one who orchestrated the deals and funded the projects. But Price was the one who had ensured those projects passed through the city council. He had influenced zoning laws, pushed through building permits, and blocked investigations into Kingsley Holdings' activities. And in exchange, Price had received millions in campaign contributions, luxury vacations disguised as business trips, and enough offshore funds to guarantee a life of comfort once he left office. Marcus's financial records had confirmed it all. Daniel sat in the back of a sleek black SUV, his gaze focused out the window as Marcus drove through the streets of downtown Arlington Heights. About the offshore accounts linked directly to Price, Marcus said as he navigated through traffic. And the emails between Kingsley and Whitmore? There are copies of those with Price's name attached. How clean is it? Daniel asked. Bulletproof, Marcus replied. Once we release it, there's no coming back from this. Daniel's eyes darkened. Good. Marcus hesitated. There's something else. Daniel's gaze sharpened. What? Marcus pulled up a file on his tablet and handed it to Daniel. This was logged 3 weeks ago, Marcus said. An anonymous transfer of $5 million to a security firm based out of Virginia. Daniel's brow furrowed. Who's the client? Marcus's expression hardened. Kingsley Holdings. Daniel's jaw tightened. What kind of security firm? Private, Marcus said. Ex-military. And they're not providing security, they're doing cleanup. Daniel's expression darkened. Price is tying off loose ends. Marcus nodded grimly. He's not going down without a fight. The attack. That night, Daniel stood by the window of Evelyn's house, his silhouette outlined against the dim glow of the streetlights. The neighborhood was quiet. Too quiet. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open. David leaned against the wall nearby, his arms crossed. Price knows we have the evidence, David said. The question is, what's his next move? Daniel's gaze remained fixed on the street outside. He's already made it. The sound of an engine idling made Daniel's muscles coil. He stepped away from the window, hand resting on the concealed weapon beneath his jacket. Marcus, Daniel said quietly. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he tapped into the local security feeds. His screen filled with grainy black and white footage of the street outside Evelyn's house. 2 black SUVs were parked at the curb. 4 men in tactical gear were already stepping onto the sidewalk. David straightened. What the hell? Private security, Daniel said coldly. Price's cleanup crew. Marcus's fingers flew over the keyboard. They've got earpieces. Military-grade gear. David's expression hardened. They're here to eliminate us. A loud knock sounded at the front door. Open up, a deep voice barked. Evelyn's gaze sharpened. Do not open that door. Daniel moved to the window, peering through the curtain. One of the men outside was holding a suppressed rifle. Another was scanning the perimeter with night vision goggles. Marcus, Daniel said calmly. Marcus was already typing, cutting the power to their comms now. Daniel pulled the pistol from his jacket and chamber round. David's hand went to his shoulder holster. With you. Daniel's eyes flashed. We end this. The first shot cracked through the night as one of the men raised his rifle toward the house. Daniel reacted instantly, pivoting toward the door and firing twice. The glass in the front window exploded as the bullet struck the gunman's shoulder, knocking him to the ground. Down! Daniel shouted. David pulled Evelyn behind the couch as 2 more men rushed toward the door. Daniel moved fast, firing a shot through the lock and kicking the door open. He grabbed the nearest man by the wrist and drove his elbow into the man's throat. Marcus's voice crackled over the comm. Security feeds are offline. They're blind. David stepped into the hallway, his pistol raised. One of the gunmen raised his rifle, but David's shot hit him in the leg, dropping him instantly. The third man stumbled toward the window, raising a handgun, only for Evelyn to appear behind him, holding an antique shotgun from the hall closet. Drop it, Evelyn said calmly. The man hesitated. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. I said drop it. The gunman's weapon clattered to the floor. Daniel stepped toward him, his gun pressed to the man's chest. "Tell Price he's next." The gunman's eyes widened in terror. Outside, the sound of police sirens grew louder. David pulled out his phone. "Backup's coming." Daniel's gaze remained cold. Too late for that. Aftermath. 2 hours later, Arlington Heights PD had the gunman in custody. Daniel stood on the sidewalk, watching as the officers loaded them into squad cars. Detective Lawrence approached, his expression grim. 3 of them are former military contractors, tied to Price's security team. Daniel's gaze darkened. "And Price?" Lawrence's jaw tightened. "We have enough to issue an arrest warrant. He won't be able to hide behind his Senate seat." Daniel smiled faintly. "Good." Lawrence hesitated. "This isn't over." Daniel's eyes sharpened. "No, it's not." Back at the house, Evelyn sat on the porch, the shotgun resting across her lap. Daniel sat beside her, his arm resting on the back of the swing. "You think Price will go quietly?" Evelyn asked. "No," Daniel said, "but he's out of options." Evelyn's gaze darkened. "He'll fight back." Daniel's smile was cold. "Let him." Evelyn's hand settled on his. "We've come this far." Daniel's gaze softened. "And we're not stopping now." In the distance, the lights of Arlington Heights glowed against the night sky. The storm was coming, and Daniel Carter was ready. The Arlington Heights Federal Courthouse was a fortress of white stone and glass, towering over the city like a silent judge. On this cold autumn morning, the steps leading to the courthouse were packed with reporters, camera crews, and protesters. The trial of Senator Malcolm Price was the biggest political scandal in the country. Every major news network had sent their top correspondents. Political analysts were calling it the largest federal corruption case in decades. Price had been charged with racketeering, conspiracy, bribery, and obstruction of justice, a list of crimes so long that the judge had joked it might take an hour just to read them all aloud. Kingsley's testimony, combined with the financial evidence Daniel and Marcus had unearthed, had been damning. Price had denied everything, until Kingsley flipped and cut a deal to reduce his sentence. And now, it was time to finish it. Daniel Carter stood in the back of the courtroom, dressed in a tailored black suit. His expression was sharp and calm, but beneath the surface, his focus was razor-sharp. He had played enough political games during his time in the military to know that power didn't die easily. At the defendant's table, Malcolm Price sat with his attorneys. He wore a navy suit and a thin smile. Even now, with the evidence stacked against him, Price projected an air of arrogance. Evelyn Carter sat in the front row, her back straight, her hands clasped in her lap. She wore a deep blue dress with pearl earrings, quiet dignity in the face of public humiliation. She had endured humiliation before. This was nothing new. David Wilson sat beside her, reviewing notes on a tablet. Marcus Taylor stood near the side of the courtroom, arms crossed, eyes focused on the defense team. Daniel's gaze flicked toward his mother. Evelyn's expression was serene, but her eyes were fierce. The bailiff's voice echoed through the chamber. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Griffin." Judge Griffin was a short, gray-haired man with a permanent scowl. He settled into his chair, adjusted his glasses, and looked down at the defense table. "Bring in the jury," he ordered. The 12 jurors filed into the box, their expressions serious. They had been sequestered for the past 2 weeks, away from the chaos of the media frenzy. Price's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named James Holloway, stood smoothly. "Your Honor, we would like to file a motion to dismiss." Judge Griffin raised a hand. "Denied." Holloway's mouth twitched. "But Your Honor." "Counselor," Judge Griffin's voice was sharp. "Sit down." Daniel smiled faintly. Price's eyes flashed toward Daniel. Daniel met his gaze without flinching. The judge turned toward the jury box. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreman, a middle-aged black woman with sharp eyes, stood. "We have, Your Honor." The bailiff handed a folded slip of paper to the judge. Judge Griffin scanned it, his expression neutral. Then he handed the paper back to the foreman. The courtroom was deathly silent. "In the case of the United States versus Senator Malcolm Price," the foreman said, her voice steady, "we find the defendant guilty on all counts." The courtroom exploded. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment. A flash of light from the cameras lit up the marble walls. Price's head jerked toward his lawyers. "Do something." Judge Griffin's gavel slammed down. "Order." Price shot to his feet. "This is a political attack. This is—" "Sit down, Mr. Price," Judge Griffin ordered. Price's mouth twisted. His lawyer grabbed his arm, but Price pulled away. "You think this is over?" Price's eyes locked on Daniel. "You think you've won?" Daniel's expression was calm. He took a single step forward. "No," Daniel said quietly. "I know we have." Two federal agents approached Price and took him by the arms. "Malcolm Price," one of the agents said, "you are hereby remanded into federal custody pending sentencing." As they led him toward the side door, Price twisted toward Daniel one last time. "You don't understand the game you started," Price growled. "There are more like me, bigger than me." Daniel's smile was faint. "Good. Then I know where to look next." Price's eyes darkened as the agents dragged him out of the courtroom. Aftermath. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed the steps. Evelyn and Daniel stood side by side as David spoke to the cameras. "This verdict is not just about Malcolm Price," David said. "It's about holding the system accountable. Arlington Heights deserves leadership that serves the people, not private interests." A reporter pushed forward. "Miss Carter, how does it feel to see justice served?" Evelyn's smile was faint but steady. "It feels overdue." Another reporter called out, "What happens next for the Carter family?" Evelyn's gaze sharpened. "We rebuild." Daniel stepped forward, his tone steady and calm. "This was never just about us. It was about protecting this city and the people who live in it. Arlington Heights is not for sale. Not anymore." More questions followed, but Daniel stepped back, guiding his mother down the steps. Marcus and David followed closely behind. The rebuilding. 3 weeks later, Daniel stood on the front porch of Evelyn's house, watching as a group of volunteers hammered nails into the frame of a new house down the street. After Price's conviction, Arlington Heights had received a $10 million restitution settlement. The funds were being used to repair the damage Kingsley Holdings had inflicted on the community. David approached, holding a file folder. "Kingsley's going to serve 8 to 10 years, David said. "Whitmore's deal gave him immunity from some charges, but he'll never sit on a bench again." Daniel nodded. "And Price?" David's smile was sharp. 25 years minimum. Daniel's gaze darkened. "Good." David handed him a folder. "There's more." Daniel opened it. Inside were reports of land acquisitions. Companies with offshore funding tied to the same networks Price had controlled. "They're reorganizing," David said. "New names, same money." Daniel closed the folder. "Where?" David's gaze sharpened. "Washington." Daniel's smile was cold. "Of course." David hesitated. "So what's the plan?" Daniel's gaze was steady. "We go where the fight takes us. The future." That evening, Daniel sat with Evelyn on the front porch swing. The neighborhood was peaceful. Children played on the sidewalk. A group of teenagers sat on the steps of a brownstone, laughing. Evelyn's hand rested on Daniel's. "You could leave this behind," she said softly. "Live your life." Daniel smiled faintly. "I've seen too much to walk away." Evelyn's gaze softened. "And now," Daniel said, "we make sure this never happens again." Evelyn's smile deepened. "Good." Marcus walked up the path, holding his laptop. "Marcus," Daniel said. Marcus's grin widened. "You want to see this?" Daniel's gaze sharpened. "What is it?" Marcus handed him the screen. "New wire transfers. Offshore accounts. Different names, same source." Daniel's smile was thin. Senator Price wasn't lying. Marcus grinned. "So what's the plan?" Daniel's gaze darkened. "We finish what we started.